Hi, I'm Jerry Toll, and I have been banding raptors now for 16 years at Hitchcock Nature Center. We got started, I got started as a hawk watcher first back in '91 with Babs and Lauren Paddleford. And about 2007, I decided that the hawk watch gave only limited information, so I wanted to start getting a banding permit. Got that in 2007 and started banding then. So our banding season is in the fall for the diurnal raptors, and we start banding about the first week in September and usually conclude about the first part of December. So, Kellie?
Hi, I'm Kellie. I am apprenticing currently with Jerry. I started apprenticing with just the Saw-Whet Owls, and as of 2021, I expanded to apprenticing for all of the diurnal raptors too. Our presentation today is going to just talk about the raptor banding process. Of course, we're going to show you pictures of the birds, and we're just going to talk about our research and all of the work that goes into it. So I guess kind of as a more expanded bio for me a little bit, I actually got started with bird banding as a passerine banding volunteer in 2018. And just kind of how banders know each other through various networks. That's how I ended up meeting Jerry in 2019. So that's when I started apprenticing for the Saw-Whet Owls. And then in 2021, I decided to try a full day at the banding blind to see what it was like. And so now I apprentice for both of the nocturnal and diurnal stations. I guess to start, we wanted to show you this really cool clip. It was filmed by John Husted in 2019. It kind of just shows all of the basics of how we capture the birds at both of our stations.
I've had other visitors, who band raptors here, and they said, this is elegant. There's other places around the country, they're doing exactly the same thing, but we're the only one in the Midwest collecting data on migrating raptors as they go through, continuously, year after year for a set period of time, so it can be used more effectively by scientists studying. 8, something like that. And I think we're ready to get started. Sandy, come to work.
I'm coming to work.
The Les Hills is a land structure that runs roughly 200 miles north and south from northern Iowa down to Kansas City, basically. And it acts like a superhighway for them because they get updrafts off the cliff faces. A lot of the raptors rely on that lift to conserve energy. There's a red tail to the left of the pole, just in the gray cloud, about 10:30.
I see it.
I'm not sure down it goes. It's a red tail. Okay, let's do this. Okay.
So I zero out the can and weigh them. Use this little gauge here to determine what size band you would use on their little feet. The natural shape of the wing is in a curve. You'll notice how it's curved. That's what we want the measurement to look like. And that's how you band a bird.
We're banding Saw-Whet Owls. It's a little migratory owl that breeds up in the north. This is an amplifier, handheld amplifier that tour buses use to talk. It's German. And by the end of the night, you're going to be so sick of hearing toot, toot, toot. We're just learning more and more about these little birds. They're hard to detect in the wild. The best way to find out about them is what we're doing tonight, and that's playing this audio lure, catching them in nets. In fact, I've never found one in the wild myself, and I've done a lot of looking. Particularly this time of night, for some reason. Don't need anything beside bags, right? Basically, I don't do much of anything until they catch owls. I just kind of tag along. You hear the bill clapping? It's trying to convince me that it's mean. But it's only 6 inches big. I think this.
You think it'll work?
I think it'll work for her.
Okay.
For if she's just careful. Hello. All fluffed out. Yeah, straighten your feathers out. Okay, I need to get the number off the foot. And 4. There's still a hatch here. The porphyrins, it's a chemical that's on fresh feathers, and it will fluoresce under black light. And so that's what's glowing. That tells us that all those feathers are fresh. And so when they're all fresh, that means it's a hatch year. This is its first year of life.
I saw that. Hi, y'all. I'm back. It's Kellie again. So I just wanted to tell everyone more about the Saw-Whet Owl banding process. To start, we kind of mentioned this already, but usually our most busy time of year is during the fall season. We start around the second week of October and continue banding until about Thanksgiving. That time frame is when saw-whets seem to be migrating through this area. We have been trying to do some spring banding. We really didn't know what dates they would be migrating through in the spring. So I have a graph later on that you can see we're kind of adjusting dates. And I think we're pinpointing when they're flying through during the spring to head north, but still doing some adjusting there. We don't band in the summer because they're really not here. So it's really not an effective time to band. And I guess one thing that's really cool about this effort is that the station began in 2009. So we have just a lot of years of data that I'm really excited to talk about. So northern saw-whet owls as a species, they're about 70 to 110 grams. They can be very hard to find in the wild when you're not actively targeting them like we are. They're just very small. They have roosting habits that they like to roost in evergreen trees, so they can be really concealed in that sense. And they're just very well camouflaged too. They typically fledge at about 4 to 5 weeks old. One thing that's kind of interesting working with saw-whets is when people see an owl of the size of a saw-whet, it's very small. some people say, oh, is it still a baby? And no, they are their full size, technically at about 4 to 5 weeks old when they fledge. The difference really is that they might be a little more hefty in size because the parents are feeding them so much. So sometimes they might weigh a little bit more than the adults. But they also have, as you can see on the right, they have this very, very cute chocolate colored plumage. One reason that we typically study the saw-whets, and that's just really interesting about them, is that they're nomadic with their migration patterns. So they don't really go to the same place during the summer up north and then during the winter down south. One thing with passerines, they typically visit the same 2 places respectively. So they have the same migration pattern year over year. With saw-whets, it's completely different. So let's say we have a saw-whet that's born in Ontario. So they will travel south for the winter. They could end up as far south as Arkansas. But then the next season, as they're flying north, they could go up to Saskatchewan. And then for the next winter, they could go all the way down south to the Sierra Nevadas. So they really just don't display the same pattern year over year. So Project OwlNet is essentially what the program is that we're contributing to. Northern saw-whet owls as a species, they used to be considered really rare. Some people had some concerns about whether they were threatened or endangered. So Project OwlNet got started kind of in the northeast area. As you can see on this diagram, there's just a lot of stations concentrated in that area. And it's kind of funny and kind of one of the good news things, like there's so much doom and gloom, but one thing that was really interesting with this is when they put up all of these stations, they realized that saw-whets are very abundant and they have a huge range across the country. Of course, we're still concerned about declines overall for a lot of species. So that's one reason why we continue to monitor them. But it's really interesting how such a wide effort as this that has expanded even into Canada has given us so much information that we hadn't had previously. I do want to say one thing about this map to the side. This is the most updated map I could find, but there's so many more stations now that just are not pictured on this diagram. I would say there's easily doubled the number of stations. So as you saw in the video earlier, we use this regulated trap. It's called a mist net. They can be, depending on conditions, they can be very hard to see. One thing that when you're apprenticing, sometimes people don't see the nets. And so sometimes they actually walk into the nest, sometimes on accident. Obviously, we want to avoid that. But that gives you an idea of just how clear and how like see-through they are. They're just very fine material. It does take a lot of practice and a lot of training to be able to get the owls out of the nets properly without hurting them. So that is why it's a regulated trap type. In addition to the mist nets, we also have an audio lure that we talk about in the video too. We essentially play the breeding call of the saw-whet, and that helps target the owls specifically to come into the area. That is also a type of trap that requires permits to use as well. So let's see this picture on the right. Oh, can you go back? Oh, this picture on the right. I don't know. I love this picture. This picture was taken by one of our other subcommittees. It is at night, so that's not the sun, that's the moon. But that gives you an idea of our setup. And to the right of that is just a saw-whet that I'm extracting from one of the mist nets. So the banding process, first we always get a weight on the bird. When we have guests for saw-whet banding, I think this is probably one of the favorite things that happens because we have this crunchy fried onion can that we have modified. We've sanded down the edge to make sure there's no sharp edges, but we just gently set them upside down. It disorients them a little bit so they just stay calm, and then we can get a weight on them clearly. Then we put them on the side. You can see on the picture on the left, I have this set of modified pliers. So there's 2 pins on top. It opens the band into a C shape. Then you load the band into the pliers. And then you put the bird's foot in like this. And then you just slowly close around. And so there is certain sizes for every species. We always make sure that we use the right size for the band, or I'm sorry, the right size band for the bird. That ensures that there's no pinching, no pain. It doesn't rub up against their foot. We also collect different biometrics. We use the measurement of the wing chord. So that's the length of the wing. We combine that with the weight. We have this really cool data set from a study, I think in '84. I can't remember the year, but it shows that depending on the combination of the wing chord and the weight, we can actually determine sex of some of these birds. And then towards the end of the presentation, you'll see an image of how we check for their pit fat. That's one of the biometrics we use to assess their health. Oh, so we'll talk about aging more with the diurnal raptors in Jerry's part of the presentation, but I just love how we figure out the age for saw-whets. As the video mentioned, they have this pigment in their wings. It's called porphyrins, and we don't fully understand why, but these actually fluoresce bright pink under UV. And so porphyrins are present in feathers when those feathers are newly grown in and when they're fresh. But then over time, those porphyrins will fade due to wear and due to sun exposure. So we look at the porphyrins in every feather on the wing, and we use the various patterns to determine the age of the bird. So as you can see, there's this image kind of in the center of the presentation. All of the feathers have a lot of pink to them. So we can determine that all of those feathers were recently grown. That means that this bird is a hatchier bird. Versus the 2 images on the side, you can see that there's some fresh feathers. There's some feathers that have a little less pink to them. We can determine based on those different patterns that those birds are more than 1 year old. All right. So this is a really cool data set, in my opinion. I love long-term data sets like this. So what we've learned is that saw-whet owls in our area, they seem to go through the cyclical fluctuation of like a boom-bust cycle. So we'll have years where there's these huge eruptions, the population just explodes. There's some theories out there that this might correlate with the prey species population cycle as well. So saw-whet owls, they really go for small mammals like mice and voles. And so the years where there is a population explosion of mice and voles, there are more resources to feed more babies. So that means that there are more babies successfully fledged from nests. And so let's see, the years like 2011, 2017, and 2020, those would be years where there's a lot of resources available for saw-whets. I also really like this graph because you can see when we started to do spring banding and how low those numbers are compared to fall banding. We've kind of determined that the fall banding is really when there's just a flood of birds. And then spring banding is when birds just kind of trickle in comparison. So you can see in 2022 when we banded, we did catch more owls because we are adjusting the timeline in which we band. So I'm hoping this year, because we're starting even sooner, we'll catch more. Oh yes, recaptures. So one of the things that's really important with banding, and one of the entire reasons why we band, is because we want to see where these birds are captured next. Excuse me. So typically at our station, we capture at least 1 owl a year. That is not an owl that we banded. Owls that we have captured and banded, they have been recaptured later on in places like Duluth. One year we had one in Saskatchewan. Let's see. Yes, and then owls that we have captured, they had been banded in Minnesota, Ontario. Two really cool stories that we have. One of the birds that we had initially banded, I think it was in 2016. In the next year, it had been recaptured again, and it had been recaptured in the Sierra Nevadas, which is just so far away in comparison to where we are. And then we had kind of a rare occurrence in 2021. One of the birds that we had banded initially in 2015, we actually ended up recapturing her in 2021. Because their cycle is nomadic, this really doesn't seem to happen very often. So that was really cool to see, both in terms of the fact that she came back to the same place at one point, and in terms of just how old she was. Because I mean, 2015 to 2021, that's 6 years. That's a really long time for a wild bird. Oh, so upcoming research opportunities. So a lot of banders are very excited about Modus. What it is essentially, it's an international telemetry effort. It essentially documents these really large movements like migration. It uses automated radio telemetry to collect this data. So all these various small animals, you can use this for more than just birds, but a small migratory animal is essentially outfitted with a transmitter, and that transmitter has a very unique code. So when this transmitter with the unique code passes by a Modus tower, it will send a ping to that tower, and that tower will actually document that code and store it. So then we can understand how all of these various animals are moving throughout the landscape, and we don't have to be actively targeting them every single time to catch them. Let's see. So transmitter size, that's one thing that people really want to be careful about. There is a rule that a transmitter size cannot be more than 3% of the bird's body weight, because after that, it does start to affect how the bird flies and moves. So depending on the size of the transmitter, the tags can last anywhere from just 1 month to up to 3 years. I love these maps on the sides. So on the far right, you can see the world map. All of those yellow dots are a Modus tower, which is it's very impressive. There are towers just going up constantly. I'm sure this map, I put this together a week ago. I'm sure this map is outdated at this point. But then on kind of towards the center, you can see zoomed in a little bit more to our region. One thing that's really interesting is in the Northeast, these towers are kind of going up at random versus there is an effort in our area. You can see it's already started in Missouri. They're actually trying to create kind of a grid system that will effectively capture animals, animal transmitters as they fly through, and it will be more effective in terms of catching all of those various small movements that they make. Oh, so here's just some fun images. On the far left, that's the different sizes for the Modus transmitters. They are essentially kind of fitted like a little backpack on the bird. So in the second image, you can see a saw-whet with a Modus transmitter. It's just really a little antenna that sticks out. They're still able to fluff their feathers to insulate properly. It really doesn't bother them. The third image, there are different types of Modus towers. So this is a really, really remote Modus tower. It's kind of just popped up with a solar panel. So this kind of tower, relatively cheap to set up, but in order to get the data, you do have to physically go to the location and download it. versus kind of like what Hitchcock has as of last year. Because it's more of an established area, it's less remote. Our tower can actually use Wi-Fi, so we don't need to actively download the info. It just goes straight to the database, which is very cool. And then last slide. So there's the gist on the far left. So an animal just basically flies within a few miles of the tower. The transmitter on the animal sends it to the tower. Tower downloads the information and stores it. I can't really drive home enough how exciting this is, because it takes so much effort to study an animal. There are so many hours that are poured into this kind of work in order to just catch one animal successfully. So as you can see, that graph on the bottom, there are 4 species that got pinged to our Modus tower at Hitchcock. And none of these birds, to my knowledge, are being actively targeted for any work in the area. So without the Modus tower, we wouldn't have had any knowledge that these birds had even passed through. So it's very exciting that we can collect this knowledge. One thing that I also find interesting about the transmitters is that they can be deployed on animals as small as dragonflies and monarchs. It's revolutionary. They can also be used for bats too, because some bats do migrate. So that's just very exciting. Let's see. So as far as our research for saw-whets goes, we have the tower. We're very excited about that. And we're currently working on trying to get more funding. The transmitters can be a little pricey. So we're hoping to get more funding for that, as well as getting those specific permits to start outfitting a handful of our saw-whets each year. That is all I had. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Kelly. Great. Just wanted to add that this is all the Modus telemetry is all collaboration between governmental sources and not-for-profits and researchers or self-funding. So it's really a large effort by a lot of people. Okay. We're going to do another video of the banding that gives a little more detail, and it shows the different band sizes and everything. So we're going to go to that now. Okay, so the first thing we do is we make sure we put the right band on it. So I measure the leg, and it's going to take a 7B band, which is this one. Right. And I put it in the can to restrain it. And it's on a scale, so I'll also weigh it. This is my data sheet for 7B, so I'll use that sheet. And I only have 1 space left. So that's going to go 49. That's the band number. 1239. And 1016 is the weight. So this should be, the last 4 digits should be 49, and they are, so I can put it on. It has this little arm that folds down over and that locks it on. So they call these lock-on bands. So I'll open it up. Well, when I'm handling this bird, I always go in from the side or underneath, because they can shoot that foot off anytime. so it's just safer to do it that way. Band goes on like this. It's aluminum, so it's soft. I can squeeze it closed. And then I lock it on there. Just like that. Check to see it moves freely, so I don't restrict the blood flow in the leg. And it does, so we're all good. Fits. Next, I measure the hallux, which is the rear talon. There's 3 in front and 1 behind. This a little bit. Okay, turn it on first. Okay, 29.5 is that measurement. And I have certain parameters for all these measurements, and while I'm doing this, I'm also checking to make sure that I'm within the parameters. But done it long enough, I'm almost always right. Tarsus is the length from this joint to this joint of the leg, and that is 84.4. See that foot jumping out there? Okay, now you can get a closer look at the tail. And I measure the length of the tail feathers. So there should be 6, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. There's 6 on a side, 12 tail feathers total. And we had one last year that had 13 tail feathers. Never seen that. In wildlife work, 211. In wildlife work, there's always anomalies. You can always expect anomalies. You take all these measurements and you're always going to find something that sometime will be different. It's outside those measurements. Okay, now I'm going to take it out of the can. See, I can feel this is its like elbow right here. No, it'd actually be knee. Their knees are, of course, backwards from humans. Whoop, whoa, whoop. I don't like what you're doing that. You're trying to get me, aren't you? Okay, now you can go back because you're out of the can. I always have to be aware of where those talons are in relation to me. Like I'm bending over, I don't want to get it too close to my leg because I have been footed in my thigh for that very reason. And I wasn't paying attention. Okay. I'm measuring the wing cord. This is a very important measurement. It's probably the most important measurement that I'll take. 378. All these are metric measurements, by the way. Very skinny. It's like you can feel, do you want to feel the keel? It's like, you know, when you're looking at a turkey, you know, that breastbone, that sternum, you can, this feels like there's hardly any muscle mass. So kind of come below and in the center. Can you feel how sharp it is?
Bony.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. That's the keel, and that measures the muscle mass. Measurement here. This will measure the length of the bill. 26.1. And this is a light morph. I'm going to say it's the eastern subspecies. There's really not too much to suggest otherwise. No. Oh, it's a borealis. Borealis is the eastern subspecies. I'll give it a 0 there. And also check to see if there's any food stored in the crop. There's none. And its eye color is yellow. And there's no molts. And 12:45. So one more measurement, one more health check we do is we look for fat. Birds store fat around the body cavity. They can be in the wing pit, down here, any place, but we check the wing pit with the raptors. It's hard to look at the other places. I'm seeing a fair amount of fat there, so it's not too bad. Their skin's pretty translucent. Since they're covered with feathers, the skin doesn't need to have pigment. A good one. Okay. I'm done taking measurements. Time to release the bird. Hello, back again. Just a follow-up to some of that banding information that you just witnessed. We put them in the cans. It tends to keep them calm, and so it lowers their stress level and also protects us from being injured a little bit more, rather than them being able to see everything that we're doing. And there are air holes at the top of that can, so they are breathing, and it really works. They can be really fidgety putting them into the can, but when you take them out of the can, they're much calmer usually, but not always. So I think that's about it. And we talked about the health. We're also checking for diseases and things. So, I can't read all that information about what we're going to talk about now. Understanding migration patterns of raptors. And I'm sorry, it's just not. So our long-term goals, or the reason why we do this, the purpose of why we do what we do, is we want to understand migration of patterns of these different raptors. I think red tails are one of our primary focuses since we catch so many of them. We can collect a lot more data on these birds, on the red tails. But we're looking at all of them, and all the raptors are very interesting creatures and have their each unique ways of making this so much interesting to get involved with us. One of the things we're also looking at the timing of migration for each species. Young tend to migrate first, then later on the older ones kind of start to come through more. Young ones are usually in September, but they can be any time because they're also coming from longer distances away. But it kind of increases over time. Then we get the older birds coming down and the more northerly birds coming down. So all of that is knowledge that we gain by this. One thing that's very interesting is the age ratios. It has to do with survivability, and we get that by recapture data as well as by, primarily by recapture data. People will find a hawk and it may be dead or alive, but they'll see that band on the leg and then they notify the banding lab, the USGS banding lab that handles all of our data, and we submit our data to them. But we also keep it for ourselves too in a hard copy. And so we get that, is the banding lab shares that information that they receive by whoever finds them with us, and then we can create maps and things to better understand what their distributions are, while we're not, that where they can be at different times, and I'll talk about a little bit later, and also how long they've lived. Sometimes they'll live as much as 6 years or 8 years, depending on the species. We also do the health checks and check for diseases. We were dealing with avian influenza this last season, so we had to do special precautions to ensure that we were not contaminating our equipment. Or if there was happened to catch one that had this influenza, which kills raptors very quickly, then we had to clean our equipment, sterilize it, sanitize it between each captors before we could proceed with the next banding. So that's something we've been doing too. We also, the recapture data, I guess I've already talked about longevity and range. So next slide, please. Okay, this is a map talking about the recapture data. This is a map of red-tailed hawks that we've compiled over the years using our recapture data. You can see that it has a very narrow longitudinal avenue that the birds tend to migrate through, but in the lower 48. But the interesting thing is with red-tailed hawks, we know by the subspecies that we get 5 subspecies here. And some of them nest in Alaska, some of them nest in Yukon or British Columbia, and in up into Saskatchewan and Alberta. We have that one dot up there. So for some reason, we're not getting the data up into Canada from people, and it's most likely due to the fact that there just aren't very many people that recover these hawks in very large landscape, over a very large landscape area. So we just haven't gotten any of that data. And so we're going to want to do telemetry at some point with red tails, hopefully using the Modus telemetry that will be expanding up into Canada, into that region. And at some point, it's going to be viable for us to use. There is another type of telemetry that we can use, much like the Modus, except that it uses satellite telemetry. And it gives you very detailed information about their migration routes. And they're actually the best, but it's also very expensive to do that. And it's just out of our price range. So that's pretty much out of our hands as far as that's concerned. Can we have the next slide? Okay, let's talk about how we capture. Kellie talked about using the mist nets, and we use those for the smaller species like the sharp-shinned hawks, merlins or a small falcon, and the kestrel, also a small falcon. So that's primarily what we target with the mist nets, and we use a lure. We have a starling that's wearing a harness that protects it inside a triangle of these mist nets. And the bird will fly into the mist net, and then we run out there and try and retrieve them before they get themselves free. And but we do sometimes catch larger ones, and it can get really tricky trying to get these larger hawks out of the nets. We have to grab heavy gloves to protect our hands, because the way they're in there, oftentimes they're talon first, and we can't get around those talons without them grabbing us. So we have to be very cautious about that. The other way we capture is with these bow nets. And we're going to run through a sequence of slides here where 2 red tails were caught in a bow net at the same time. That's only happened twice in the 16-year history of this, and we're going to run through that. This is the two, and they're vying to get control of the pigeon, which you can see the leather harness and the pigeon down there in the left corner. So this one hawk in front is trying to get around the one behind it and go on out. And he manages to do that. The other one kind of gets out of the way. So he gains control. Next slide. But they're still arguing about who gets control and gets the prey. Next slide. And the other one circling around behind is going to try and get behind it. And I am at the same time that these photos are being taken by Ty Smedes, a master photographer who's loved to come out and take photos and get really good shots like this one. I am waiting for the right opportunity for them both to be safely inside the mist net before I trip it. And now they're getting there. And so now I think the next slide is I trip it, and you can see the bow net. It's going to flip over the top. Next slide. And now they're completely enclosed, and neither one were injured in this. We're very careful with this bow net because you can kill or injure a raptor in this net. So we know how to operate it, and we do it safely. And we have not had a mortality with it. I did have a red tail that got a broken wing one time, and that's the worst it's happened in about over 1,000 captures, I believe. Okay, next slide. Here's some of our statistics. Red-tailed hawks are like I said, the one we capture the most of. In 2022, in the fall 22 season, we captured 118 of the 173 total that we captured. Our average is about 98, so it was actually a better year. But the red-tail movement was about 2 weeks behind this year. So I put a lot of hours in November as well. We usually stop around October 31st on Halloween. But I put in a lot more hours in November, and it really paid off because we captured about 40% more because of proceeding into November. Sharp-shinned hawks, the smallest one we catch, they're about robin size, actually, the smallest raptor that we catch. We caught 33, which again was above average, so that's good in 2022. Cooper's hawks are very similar to sharp-shinned hawks, but they're larger. And there's no overlap in their size. We caught 17 of those in 2022, and again, slightly above average, so that's good. Merlin, we caught 2 in 2022, but we also catch all these. We have caught low numbers of all these other species. Peregrines, we like to catch 1 or 2. We didn't catch any this past year. Prairie falcons, we've only caught 2, and both of them occurred in 2009. Merlins, we usually catch a few, but there's been a few years that we didn't catch any. Kestrels are probably one of the most common, next to red-tail, species of raptors that we have here in the Midwest, and you would think we would catch them, but we don't. They're seen, pretty frequently at the Hawk Watch, but we don't catch them. We just don't have, I think, the right lure down for them to be attracted, and they will eat a lot of insects. So really, they're not tied to eating mice, which they will eat. But we've had them sit up on top of our lure pole, which is about 12, 15 feet high, and they'll sit up there and look down at our lures of pigeons and starling and say, well, no, I'm not going to bother with that. And they start hunting grasshoppers from up there. They'll sit up there for 15, 20 minutes if we let them. So, and then we know by that time that we're not going to catch them. We also catch broad-winged hawks. We caught 2 of them this past year, and that's really kind of high for us. Oftentimes we won't catch any, but some we have caught maybe 3 or 4 years that we've caught them. Swainson's hawks are another one. I'm going to go in more detail about these other species that we catch in just a minute. Swainson's hawks, we'll catch them pretty rarely. I think it's only been twice we've caught a Swainson's hawk. We have caught a couple of, I think, 3 red-shouldered hawks. And last year in 2020, no, 2 years ago, in 2021, we caught our first roughleg. And the reason why, one of the reasons I started banding in overtime in November's is because roughlegs come later in the season. And I really wanted to catch a roughleg, and finally in 2021 we did catch a roughleg, and you'll see that bird. Next slide. Okay, I'm going to talk about aging. We catch 5 subspecies of red-tailed hawks, and I'm talking about red-tailed hawks first. I think I've got something covering up the top of my screen here. Just a minute. Yeah, there it is. Now I can see it. We're talking about red-tailed hawks. They're, like I said, the most common and the most interesting, even though they're the most common raptor we have here in the Midwest. They're really a fascinating species. So I'm going to talk about aging them. We get 5 subspecies that come down from the north and from the west in the Midwest here, which is really unusual. You would think of migration being mostly their movement being north and south, but they move also longitudinally to the east in order for us to catch them. There are 15 total subspecies of red-tailed hawks that extend down into Central America. There's a lot more subspecies down in Central America in the tropics and subtropics, but we get 5 of those subspecies, and I think there's 3 subspecies that we do not catch that are found in North America. And they're either far west or along the west coast or down in southern regions that we don't get them here. So there's also 2 color morphs. Morphs mean morphology or form. So there's a dark morph, which is blackish or melanistic, which means dark. You know, when you tan, that's melanin in your skin. Well, they get the same thing in their feathers, and so some will have a dark form. The other form is the light form, which you see here. It's the most common, and we do catch the dark morphs, and you'll see some of those. The other buteos that we catch, there's 4 or 5 other species, which I went through briefly. Most of those will have a color morph as well, a dark morph color morph. The red-shouldered hawk is the exception. It doesn't have a color morph. They're all light morphs. Now they're in between. You got to remember that red-tailed hawks, there's a lot of breeding, mixing, and so you'll see some what we consider intermediate. You may have one parent that's a light morph, and then one parent that's a dark morph, and then you'll see sort of a mix between colors, mix of the amount of coloring in the dark morph when you see it, and it can be just more white in the appearance, or it can have a sort of a rufous tinge to it for the most part. So you'll see that. Let's go next. Okay, I'm going to talk about, first thing I'm going to talk about, on your right, you're going to see the juvenile plumage. This bird is in its first year of age, and you can see it has a different plumage. The tail being the most spectacular difference, but and then in its first, it'll molt almost a complete molt, which means it replaces all the feathers after its first year of life, and it will do that sometime generally after the breeding season, but may start during the breeding season, say in oh boy, I'm running long. Okay, so I'm gonna have to cut this a little short. We're running long, but I wanted to point out in the adult bird, you've got the bright red tail, and that's pretty typical of the east. But you can see that some are shorter than others, and that's an evidence that it was started its molt late, and those feathers are growing in, so they haven't reached their full length. But if you look in the right wing, I believe that's what you're seeing, you're going to see one brownish, much more brownish feather in the flight feathers, the longer feathers that are closer to the body. And that's a retained feather from its juvenile feather. And when we see that, then we know that it's just a second year, because they have retained that juvenile feather. You can age them past their second year, but we usually call it after second year, meaning that we know that's older than 2 years old. And the way we determine that is by, you'll see older and newer feathers, but you can see that they're different. They have a different shape, and they just look worn. They look like they're old and kind of beat up and worn. And so but not looking like the juvenile feather. They have a different shape to them, and they actually appeared quite different looking. But when they're compared to the other feathers around them. But anyway, and then we can determine that it's older than 2 years old. Next slide. Okay, this is the underside of an adult feather, an adult red tail. You can see that the red will show in a little bit underneath on the tail. Okay, the next slide. This is the typical eastern form. And the typical eastern form, yes, thank you. And that's what we see here during the breeding time. The other ones come down in the fall and stay, into early to mid spring, and then we'll start going back to the eastern subspecies. Okay, next slide. Okay, this is the sort of more of an intermediate morph. It's of the western subspecies. You can see that it's much more heavily marked, and see that reddish patch on the breast. That's why it's kind of an intermediate form of the dark morph. You'll see that the tail pattern is different. It's kind of a combination, heavily banded form. You'll see much more of the banding evidenced in that. You can see the throat is darker. If we look, I think I don't know if I have another slide of this, and the next one is the same one. Yeah, you can see the darkness in the throat. This is of a light morph western. Also the patagium, which is the leading edge of the wing, you see that darkish patch. In the western form, it's much wider than the eastern patch. You'll also see a heavier belly band. In the summer, that belly band is not as pronounced in the eastern subspecies. You also, in the wing lining above the flight feathers, that area between the patagium and the flight feathers, oftentimes that has kind of a reddish wash in that area too. So we have to combine all these different things to get a clearer understanding. And the thing is, with red tails, there's something called intergrades. That means we can see characteristics of the different subspecies in a bird that we get here because the ranges are so close to each other that they interbreed between the subspecies. And so it gets really challenging, and sometimes you can't say, well, it's not entirely western, it's not entirely an eastern, it's not entirely Harlan's, which we'll go to next. I think. I can't, yeah, thank you. This is the, oh yeah, this is the criters. This is, again, we have another problem with red tails. The thing is, we don't know if this is actually a subspecies or if it's just a form of the eastern. It occurs in the Dakotas up into southern Canada. And it's a very light form. You can see it's much more heavily washed with white. The darker areas are much lighter. In the adult criters, the tail will be all white, mostly white, with very little barring on it. And the head will be much lighter and as well across the back. Next one. Okay. Now this one we're calling a northern. Again, this is another form that we don't know for sure if it's considered a subspecies or not. There's still some discussion, a lot of discussion on whether to classify these as different subspecies. Different banders consider them one way or the other. So at this point, I'm kind of following the lead of what the banders say. So we're going to call this a northern subspecies, or the Accipiter. And the way they differentiate them mostly is that heavy belly marking. It's kind of a blobby form is how it's described. That's not a very technical term, but that seems to be the term that's being used. So we're using that as well. There are some other minor little things that we look at, but and other red tails can have this, but we're kind of using not only the fact that, you know, later in the season we get these far northern birds coming down, and then we have a better idea that these are the Accipiters, the northern ones that are down here, and so then we're more likely to call these the northern subspecies at this point. Okay, next slide. Excuse me. Okay. Now we're talking about the Harlan subspecies. This is a light morph, Harlans. They're actually much more common than people think, than birders think. Oftentimes we'll see the dark morph, like people are just birding or seeing a dark red tail perched. They'll think that's a Harlan's. Well, they're not all there. There is actually a light morph also that we see, but unfortunately, you really can't tell the light morphs unless you can have them in hand. Oftentimes, unless you see them really close and really close details. But one of their major characteristics is their tail can be highly variable. And you can see with this juvenile, you can see it, instead of the really clear banding in the bars in their tail, you're seeing kind of a modeling. And this one's more grayish. They're not always that, but this is, I thought, one of a good example of a juvenile Harlan's. Let's see the adult next, I think. Yeah, this is another one. This is more typical of the juvenile Harlan's. And this is the dark morph. You can see the body is now dark, and the wing linings are also dark. The one thing that we also go by is the body coloring on the back is actually more of a chocolate color instead of a medium brown color. And that helps us differentiate Harlan's from the dark morph of a Western or even of an Eastern. So next slide. Okay, this is the second morph, second year, 2-year-old here. You can, if you look in that, it's the left wing. You can see those two wings that are close, or two large feathers that are close to the body. They're all brown. There's that retained juvenile feathers that this bird has. But look at the interesting part, and you can also see it's kind of more heavily marked. Well, we're calling this an intergrade between a northern and a Harlan's. because if you look at that tail, see how interesting that is, how highly variable. They can be all white, or they can be all mottled, or they can be just a combination of an adult Eastern looking tail. They can have that dark band at the end of the tail or not. It just really can be highly variable. And so this is one of the coolest birds. We caught this bird this year, and it was one of the later ones that we caught. So we're really happy we have that slide. Okay, next. Well, okay, this is a fun little story. This is just a red tail that we let go, and sometimes we'll set them down on the ground. First thing they do is turn around and face you, and they try and make themselves look big. Well, a couple times I've run out to the mist net, and with a red tail being caught in it, and just as I get there, the red tail will get out of the net, and it'll stand. Oftentimes they fly off. This happens fairly frequently. Most times they fly off, but once in a while they'll just stand there. And so the first time this happened, I just thought, well, okay, what do I do? I want to try and catch this bird. I wasn't wearing gloves. There's no way I could approach it from the front because it will foot me. So I tried to grab its wing to kind of spin it around, but it wasn't having it. He kept facing me. And then I thought, oh, okay, I pulled off my shirt, threw it over him so he couldn't see what I was doing, and then I was able to kind of grab that wing again and then grab him from behind around the waist, and then I could control him and safely capture him. So that's just one of the fun stories that happens at, when you're banding. Next slide. Okay, sharp-shinned hawks and Cooper's hawks, really, they look very similar. The Cooper's is larger. There's no overlap in their size, even though if you're seeing them on the wing, you really can't tell that. You have to look at a couple things. The Cooper's hawk's head will extend in front of the front line of the wing, and also the tail could be rounded, but not always. Okay, next slide. This is a sharp shin. They see that really scarlet colored eye. That is a process. The juvenile eye is kind of yellowish, and by the second year it can start turning orange, but scarlet means this is a much older bird, but not always. We can't use that to age because it's not reliable. It can vary from 2 to 4 years to get that scarlet eye. They're also very bold. You can see the juvenile one going for this pigeon that obviously is much larger than it is, but they'll come down and try and capture that sometimes. If you look back at the adult one on the other side, you can see that the breast is barred. That makes it an adult, and it's also reddish. Look at that bulge under its throat. Oftentimes we'll capture these, and they'll be storing their food in their throat, in their crop. Because they're so small that they need to carry, to fly with this. Most of the other birds, we don't see a lot of food in the crop, but with the sharp shins, that's pretty common. Next slide. Here you can see that I transitioned from a juvenile on the right to the left is the adult orange eye in transition, but you can see the barring on the breast and it's streaking on the young ones. And again, a full crop on that young one. Next slide. This applies to the Cooper's hawk, same thing. Their eyes change. They have that transition between the juvenile and the adult plumage, and they look very similar. Next slide. Northern goshawk, we've caught 2, and it happened the same year in 2009 that we caught the prairie falcons. This is the only slide in the series that is not from here. I had the opportunity to band at Cape May, New Jersey in 2016, and I caught 2 goshawks in that week that I was there. And this is a video of what it's like to be with a goshawk in a blind.
what bird is this? What bird?
This is a goshawk, H-12 goshawk.
Okay. Yeah, that screaming is deafening. And falcons will do that too. They're high strung. Goshawks are high strung. And you try and keep their stress levels down, but sometimes it just doesn't work. And this is a juvenile goshawk. The other one that I caught there was also a juvenile goshawk. Both these raptors were killed in car collisions within about 3 months after this capture. And I think there's just way too many people back east, and their hunting habit is to fly low. So they'll fly low right in front of a car. And that really works against them when they're not in rural areas. So the hawk watch sees goshawks, but we rarely catch them. I guess I've seen a couple, but haven't been able to catch them. Next slide. And one more thing, the sharpshins and Cooper's hawks and goshawks are all accipiters. So they have that same body shape. They hunt very similar manner, and they all eat birds. Okay, northern harrier. It's in a genus all by itself. This is one cool bird. If you see them in flight, they look large. They because their wings are so large and their tail is so long, you can see that. When you have them in hand, you can see that their body is actually very small. They're smaller than the Cooper's hawk. And they have that really owl-like face too. They weigh next to nothing. They're just an amazing bird. And their hunting habits are also flying very low over the top of the grass, looking for mice down in the grass. And but when they migrate, we can see them very high. They'll get up really high and just kind of float up there. They're very cool to handle. I think we've captured this. I think this is from last year, and I think the year before we caught one, and that was the first time we'd caught harrier. So just a cool bird, and I love handling them. Go ahead. Okay, this is a gyrfalcon. It's the largest of the 4 falcons we get in North America. This is the only gyrfalcon that's ever been banded in Iowa, and it was it just surprised the heck out of me. It came in low over the roof of the shed, coming from behind, went down through. I knew it was a falcon by the shape of the wing. And when I thought, oh man, I got a chance at a peregrine, and it went right into the net, and I caught it. And I walked up to it, and I'm looking at it, and it looks different, and it looks weird. And I think, well, this is really kind of a weird looking peregrine. It's the right size. Is it a prairie falcon, which is also about the right size? And it wasn't until I got back to the banding shed that I realized what I had. Just an amazing bird. Just beautiful. And I held on to this bird for about 20 minutes, which is very untypical. We will hold on to him for about 10 minutes typically. We try and get them out of the shed just as fast as possible, keep their stress level down. And but I wanted this had to be documented. I knew it had to be documented. So a couple people came over from the Hawk Watch to do the photography so we can get this bird documented. So we took a series of slides. You can do next is the underside. And I love this shot because I'm looking through the wing. Next slide. Interesting feather patterns. Again, and this bird was very calm. It screamed at me a little bit before I put it in the can, but it calmed right down when I put it in the can. It's about the same size as a red tail, and it takes the same size bands. So it's a large falcon. The Cooper's hawks is considerably smaller. I'm sorry, I shouldn't mention kookaburra. Peregrine is smaller. That's the comparison. The peregrine is smaller. It can be in this about the same size, but it's also can be smaller. There's 3 different color morphs to a deer falcon. The brown, that gray morph is the one we see in North America typically. Greenland has a white morph. Iceland has a brown morph. And there are some documented cases of the brown morph being in North America, but I don't think the ones that are seen in North America that are white are actually escapees from falconers who love to have these and peregrines as falconer birds. Okay, now we can advance. Okay, peregrine falcon. This peregrine is darker than most peregrines that we see. We see the tundrous subspecies and the anatom subspecies. The tundrous breeds up in the high Arctic. The anatom can be found out throughout the continent, and is the one that is the subspecies that's found here in the Midwest. Along the Mississippi River is their historical breeding ground, but they're also now breeding in cities, so it's changing. This one looks more like the peels, which occurs just along the west coast. It's a much darker version or form that is there, and luckily we had Teresa Ely here. She banded for 2 years in the fall season with me. She was working on her master's degree at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and she was going stir crazy because she didn't have any, couldn't band any raptors, so she loved coming out while she was here. And then now she is now the banding director at Golden Gate Raptor Observatory in San Francisco, her hometown. So she's back in the fold and she's banding raptors all the time. So it's great. We can do our next slide. Okay, you see the peregrine falcon on the one side with a really dark head. This is a comparison between the two. Peregrines have a bluish tinge to their back, but they can be kind of brownish. The juveniles are that way. But the prairie falcon in flight is this kind of a lighter brown, and their head markings are much almost non-existent. The difference on the underside is that the wing, where the wing meets the body, the part of the wing closest to the body is really dark, and we call that the axillary area. And tails can look different too. But that's the main thing when you see them on the underside. Prairie falcons tend to fly low. They are also a low hunter. They'll fly right above the deck in their hunting progress, but in migration, you can see them higher. Okay, next. Okay, this is a much more typical peregrine. This is an adult peregrine. You can see the back is bluish. Next slide. And I love this photograph with Sandy. Sandy is not sleepy. She is just blinking. You cannot be sleepy when you're holding a peregrine in your hand. So this is, let me see, the one, okay, the one that's being held in the arm, you can see that the darkness under the eye is much broader. So it's probably more of an anatom, one of the continental peregrines, and the one Sandy is holding that area is narrower, and it also has a sort of a whitish area above the nose between the eyes, and that's characteristic more of the tundrius subspecies. And I also wanted to point out, see those color bands on the legs? We put them only on the peregrines. And I put one on a gyrfalcon because it would fit, because I wanted to know if it ever was sighted again. But that's specific for the them, and it makes it much more easy to identify a peregrine. We had one peregrine that was identified in Mexico a couple of years back. One of the ones we banded at the OPPD power plant in North Omaha, which is another thing I do. Okay, next. Merlin is a smaller falcon. It's sort of in the size between the peregrine and the kestrel. There are two subspecies. The browner one is one of the prairies, which it breeds, I believe, in the upper Midwest and in the West also. The taiga breeds up in the, not the boreal forest, but the mixed forest up in Canada, and it comes down into this area, and the breast is much more heavily marked. The white field stays about the same, but the markings are whiter and darker in color, not brownish. Next slide, please. And this is your typical male kestrel. Again, very common species, but we don't catch them very often. And in the background, you can see all the different size bands we use. I didn't cover that too much before. Each bird has a different size band, and we have to be very careful putting them on. Next. Broadwing hawk. We've only caught a few of those. This is an adult broadwing. You can see how different it looks. The tail is much shorter. The wings are not nearly as long. They're kind of stubby, and we can see them and see that in flight. They migrate through in usually large flocks by the time they get to us, and they go down into Central America and Colombia during the wintertime. So they flock together. Next slide. We've only caught a couple of those. These are Swainson's hawks. I don't have a good slide of Swainson's hawks, so we didn't present that way, but they do the same thing. They go down to Argentina, and we used to see large flocks like this come through, but in recent years they have not been passing over us. Doesn't mean that the population is in trouble necessarily, but they've just taken a different migration route, staying more towards their habitat in central Nebraska and western areas rather than coming through in the east, closer to forested areas. Excuse me. Okay, rough-legged hawk. I finally caught one in 2019, and just an absolutely gorgeous bird. They have these dark crescents on the wrists where the wing folds, and that upper breast is usually lighter but streaked. The head is usually lighter than a red tail. The tail looks much different. It has a white zone on it, and that differentiates it from the red tail in flight. But their hunting strategies are different. They act differently in their flight. Next slide. Red-shouldered hawk. We've caught, I think, just 2 of these. And you can see that area right by the body on the wing. You can see how reddish it is. This one, I believe, and they also have that crescent in the wing. That's how you tell them on the wing. Yeah, we'll see them. The hawk watch sees them regularly each year. They're not an uncommon species, and sometimes we'll see them at the banding station, but we rarely catch them. So, next slide. Now I'm talking about the raptors we have yet to catch that we would like to catch. We are licensed to band eagles, but we have to have at least 2 people and the right equipment in the banding station in order to do it properly. So we have not even tried, but I've only had 2 opportunities to catch a golden eagle. And the first one, the first time that happened was it came in. I was working on a mist net, trying to get a merlin out of the net. And I heard this whoosh right beside me, and I looked over, and a golden eagle passed just within feet of me, going to the pigeon lure, and hit the pigeon and pulled itself right into the net. And there was absolutely no way I could trap it. I could trip the bow net in order to catch it. So I just turned back around and continued trying to work, get the merlin out. And eventually the golden eagle saw me and took off. Again, I think next picture. This is a second-year bird, probably. Oh, we did have another golden eagle come in this year, and I got some really nice pictures of it coming in and making passes at the pigeon lure, but it ultimately decided it wasn't going to step into that trap. It just, I don't know, just cautious, and that's not an uncommon thing for them to do. We don't always catch everything that comes down. This is my big wish. This is a ferruginous hawk. We only see 2 or 3 at the most a year at the Hawk Watch. And I think I've seen a ferruginous hawk, but it's one that I can catch, but I haven't had absolutely no chance of catching so far. It just hasn't happened. They come a little later too. November is much more likely. They have come a little earlier in October, but mostly into November. So that's still on my wish list. And they're a little larger than a red tail, and I understand they're a little harder to handle than a red tail. So I'm looking forward to the opportunity. We do have bands to band them. Okay, I think that's it. Yeah, big thank you to the people we work with. Sandy Rankin has been banding with us since the beginning at the banding station and with owls, and then now Chris and Kelly have joined us, and Abby Richardson is still going to be working with us at some point in the future. We hope she moves back here. She's moved out of state. She's in the military, and we hope she's able to come back and join the team again. Special photographic credits to Tice Modus, who a lot of these pictures were really phenomenal photographs, and that's all Ty's work. He loves coming over and spending time with us. Earl Johnson was one of our paid counters at the Hawk Watch one year, and he was an excellent photographer too. And the peregrine shots were largely due to Earl, and I think there's a couple more in there too. So with that, we're done. If there's any questions, I think we will go to that.
All right. Well, it looks like we have one question in the chat.
Okay.
It's what are some safety precautions you take while banding for yourself and for the wildlife? Do you want to take that one, or should I?
Okay, well, I'll take it, I guess. Well, I mentioned it a few things earlier about, the can. We're very cautious. We're always respectful of the birds. It's very important to us that no one gets injured during this process. We protect ourselves when we know we need to. We have learned over the years how to handle raptors with our bare hands, and we very rarely get anything more than a scratch or just a minor poke by a smaller raptor. Kelly has yet to experience being footed by a red tail yet, so I'm looking forward to that, and she's a little fearful, I'm sure, because it is very painful when it happens. But it's part of the process. It's going to happen, and we have to accept it. We have to accept it. But we're very skillful in what we're doing, and in Kelly's training and in anyone else we train, we make sure that they're very well trained before we let them operate on their own. And the banding lab is the same way. So that's, in order for her permit to be expanded to handling raptors, she has to have a certain level of experience. And I think that answers the question.
Yeah. I guess I would add with, you kind of talked about this already, but with the avian influenza protocol to protect the wildlife, we sanitize everything in between red tails. Red tails and peregrines, since they seem to go for those species that are asymptomatic carriers. So like the ducks, especially, even if the bird necessarily doesn't look sick, we still go through the process of sanitizing all of the equipment. And in some of our more recent photos, you can see that we're also wearing nitrile gloves for those larger birds. We switch out those gloves every time too, so that we're not using our hands to accidentally transfer contaminants from one bird to another.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I can't think of anything else. It looks like we don't have any other questions.
Okay. Well,
Yeah.
Thank you, Kylie, so much. Kylie's been
Yeah.
our IT person today and has made everything, we hope, run smoothly.
Yes. Thank you
Thank
so
you,
much,
Kylie.
everyone.